I'm an Uber driver in the Atlanta area. It's a great place to be an Uber driver, and there's always someone who needs a ride somewhere. I spend 6 hours a day in college classes, another 8 sleeping, and the rest of my time shuttling people to and fro around the Atlanta area. I've been doing this for about 3 years, and in that time, I've seen it all. I've had drunken frat boys that threatened to kick my ass when I wouldn't give them a ride. I've had annoying, nagging passengers who've constantly made me want to pull my hair out. I've seen the occasional cheating spouse hoping not to get caught, the local celebrity on their way to an event, the online influencer who thinks they're way more important than their subscriber count would suggest, just to name a few. I've had my fair share of funny moments too. The man and his potential lover who met his wife on the sidewalk, the 2 ladies deciding to go get a drink after they had thoroughly screamed at him, never gets old. And I've also had some scary times. The lady with the neck wound who nearly bled out in the back of my car after her boyfriend just pushed her in and ran off came to mind, for certain. Despite all my experience, though, this story definitely falls under the weird category. Well, I guess we can upgrade it into the scary category, all told. Any night where I almost lose my life can definitely be called scary. This happened in October, about a week before Halloween. My girlfriend and I live in a duplex near campus. I've lived there for about 4 years, and she's lived there for about 6 months. We were taking a semester off since none of the classes we needed were available in the fall, and on the night in question, I was hurrying to get ready so I could drop her off at the airport before I started working. She was going on a weekend trip to see her parents in Virginia, and I'd have the house to myself all weekend. I was a little skeptical about her destination, but I decided to let her dig her own grave if my suspicions were correct. Maybe it was all the extra time I was spending at home, but I'd started to notice that something was a little off about her lately. She'd been fired from her job recently, and though she kept saying she was going to get another one, I didn't see her making any effort to do so. All she seemed to do was talk to people on Discord. She'd gotten really into this local group, spooky stuff from what I'd seen, and she was constantly chatting and texting with them. I was suspicious, but I wasn't really worried. At that point, I figured the worst she could do was dump me. We chatted on the way to the airport, talking about what she'd do once she got there, and how much she would miss me. She bemoaned how bored she would be at her parents' house, and when we arrived at the airport, she kissed me goodbye and headed into the busy terminal. As she left for her parents' house, or wherever she was going, I decided to get some work in, since I was at the airport anyway. I pulled into the temporary parking area and signed into the Uber app. The airport was usually an excellent place to find fares, and sure enough, someone was trying to get a lift. He wanted to go to a hotel nearby, and after agreeing to the ride, I moved back into the concourse to pick him up. He was a big dude, around 6 feet and muscular. He had a bag, which he put in my trunk, and a smaller bag, which he kept on his lap. I asked him where he was going, and he verified the address, so off we went. He was pretty quiet the whole way there. He looked cramped in my back seat, like a sardine in a can, but he took it well. Mostly he just played on his phone, typing away to someone as we rode in silence. That wasn't uncommon, and I honestly preferred clients who weren't chatterboxes. There was nothing worse than trying to hear your GPS over some drunk backseat DJ who wants the aux cord, or some tourist who wants a guided tour of the city as you dodge rush hour traffic. We drove for about 20 minutes before pulling up outside the hotel without much fuss. I told the guy we'd arrived, and he quickly slipped the phone into his carry-on and offered to tip me for arriving so quickly. I said it wasn't necessary, since that sort of thing was usually handled through the app, but he went ahead and slipped a 20 up next to my headrest, and I took it with thanks. Rules or not, money is money. He asked if I'd pop the trunk, and when he had his suitcase, he thanked me and walked towards the front of the building. I was getting ready to check the app for fares in the area when I heard a noise from the back seat. It was that high-pitched ding noise that so many phones use for notifications, and when I looked in the back seat, I realized the guy had forgotten his carry-on. It had slipped into the floorboard, and I could see the black light on his cell phone through the mesh. I dug out the phone and started to reach for the door when my eyes registered what the message on the lock screen had said. A picture of a pretty blonde was next to the message, and she was asking if he'd gotten to the hotel yet. Another popped up to say that she was running a little late, but she'd be there in 5. She couldn't wait to meet everyone, and she was so glad that she had finally done this. And it was about time they all got together, and the picture was of my girlfriend. I just stared at the phone for a few minutes before someone honked at me and I drove into a parking spot. A cab had just pulled up behind me, and as I parked, I couldn't help but notice when my girlfriend stepped out and walked to the hotel. She still had her suitcase, her furry boots, her parka, the leggings that she had left the house in, and she smiled hugely as she looked at the hotel. She clearly hadn't seen me, which was good because I had about 1,000 questions I would have likely bombarded her with. She was supposed to be on a flight to Virginia, but instead, it looked like she was meeting some random guy from Discord. Was she cheating? Cheating seemed to be the most obvious answer, but why? We'd never had any problems. Our relationship had been smooth since the beginning. Why now was she... The phone dinged as another message popped up, but this one was from a different guy. "How many have arrived?" he asked. My girlfriend responded, "5, Master. Damien seems to have lost his phone, but he's here too." I had meant to check for fares in the area, but instead I found myself watching the phone as the messages rolled in. I was in full information gathering mode now, and anything I could come back with would help me in the long run. If this was a misunderstanding or something, I wanted to know before I melted down on my girlfriend. As it stood, though, it was beginning to look very sketchy. I couldn't open the phone, of course. It was one of those fingerprint lock ones that wouldn't open without a password or a fingerprint, and since I knew neither, all I could do was watch the dialog boxes come up. The boxes only stayed for a couple of seconds, and often the messages were too long for the boxes to contain the whole thing, so I was forced to read a little at a time. What I read made me think my initial suspicions might be off. At first, it looked like she was meeting people at a hotel for an unspecified event. As I waited, I saw other people approach, their faces matching the images on the app. I was pretty sure that these people were the ones she was waiting for, because their arrival at the desk was followed by confirmation that someone else had arrived. After 8 or 9 of them had gone up, they began talking to the mysterious Master. The more they talked, the more I realized that this wasn't a weird sex thing. The group started talking about the Ascension and the altar site, to which he responded that they would learn more tonight. He asked my girlfriend if the sacrifice was ready, and she informed him that it would be there when the time came. He quoted some verses that sounded pseudo-biblical and referred to them as the Coven several times. The more I read, the more I began to believe that she might be part of a cult instead. I sat outside the hotel for several hours, and as it got dark, he told them that the preparations were taking longer than expected. He told them they should meet him at the altar site and sent directions, which I got about half of. He told them to be there before dark, and like a flock of birds, they came from the hotel and moved towards cars parked in the parking lot. I ducked down, not wanting to be seen, and I watched as she got into a late-model black sedan. The sedan drove away in a convoy of other vehicles, and since I didn't have all the directions, I cranked my car and followed them. As they moved out of town and got onto the highway, I tried not to make it obvious that I was tailing them. The freeway was busy. It's close enough to end-of-day traffic that I can hide in a crowd, but as we left the interstate, it became harder to blend in. As the sun sank, I saw the turnoff for the access road, their cars kicking up dust as they rumbled down the gravel road. I didn't want to lose them, wherever they were going, so I pulled off the road for a few minutes before following. It turned out they were heading for Panola State Park. As I drove down the bumpy outlet road, the sun started to set for real. The trees started leaning in on me like hands in a funhouse, and the road was so narrow that if someone decided to leave, I'd be in for some trouble. The darkness had swallowed my car before I reached the end, and all at once, my headlights created beacons of light in the encroaching blackness. The park was beautiful during the day, but in the late night shadows, it had a spooky look to it that only wooded areas in fall can pull off. I suddenly had Blair Witch flashbacks as I trumbled through the spooky backdrop. My girlfriend was definitely into some weird stuff here, weirder than even my imagination could have conjured up, and I knew that I needed to get her out of there before things got bad. When I reached the end of the outlet road, I found a dark parking lot with several cars in it. It must have been a campground at one point or another. I could see a bathroom and a picnic area off the parking lot, and the lot was flanked with lights that no longer seemed to work. I turned off my lights and got out of my car, but when no one immediately came out to get me, I figured they had moved on. I snuck around the building, and sure enough, they were bathrooms. One was a men's room, and one was a women's room. Both were unlocked, but the doors had that broken-into look. Someone had set up a couple of tents in the shadowy space between the building and the forest, but so far I'd seen no one. As I took a step towards the tents, however, a bright light sprang up to my left, and I saw a large bonfire crackling in the woods. It was off to the side of the campground, and for a moment, the sudden flash left me glare-blind. When hands caught me under my arms and dragged me forward, I was momentarily unable to fight back. By the time my eyes adjusted to the sudden flare of the lights, I was already close enough to feel the bonfire's heat and hear the chanting of those around it. It had been low at first, but now it had reached a fever pitch as they drew me closer to the fire. I struggled, but the two men who had me were much bigger than I was. I was pretty sure that one of them was the fare I'd had earlier, and we came up just short of walking into the fire. A robed man in a lacquered mask stepped up and raised his hand for silence, the chanting tapering off as they turned towards me. We stood in silence for 30 seconds before the masked man spoke. Unlike the muscle-bound guys holding me, the guy was not on speaking terms with physical exercise. His robes bulged in front, and had I not been suspended between two men, he would have still been a head shorter than me. When he spoke, though, it was apparent that he had power here. This one must be Master. As I told you, as Sister Serenity said, the sacrifice has arrived. Another robed figure moved away from the group and stood beside the fat robed man. She was about my height and had shoulder-length blonde hair. When I met her gaze, I realized it was my girlfriend. I wondered why I didn't recognize her at first, but it became apparent almost immediately. In the firelight, her hair was a frizzy mess as opposed to the straight and silky curtain she almost always kept it in. She looked almost feral as she stared at me, and I didn't see any of her usual warmth there. All of her love or happiness was gone, and she looked at me as though I were meat, like I was something that would bring her joy once I was cooked black and offered on a plate. I was put on my knees before her, and the fat man handed her a silver knife that he drew out of a scabbard like a magic trick. She looked at the knife like she'd never seen one before, and as she returned to reality, she approached me with the blade. I finally realized what I should have seen from the beginning. I was the sacrifice. He'd left the phone in my car on purpose, and even though there was no way she could have known that he'd get in my car, somehow she had. She'd meant for me to be here, for me to be her sacrifice. And as she raised the knife, I had to know why. "Why did you do this? I thought you loved me," I said, sounding pathetic, but still dying to know what this was all about. She looked at me, surprised, before saying, "Because it's why I got with you in the first place. There's always a sacrifice before the coming of winter. The Green Man requires a gift, and it was my turn this year. I had to have someone to give to the fire, and you were there to fill the role." And with that, she raised the knife, and I closed my eyes as I prepared for the strike. When the bullhorn sounded, it scared me just as much as it scared them. "Drop the knife and put your hands in the air. You're all under arrest for—" "Hey, don't move or we'll—" But it was too late. The knife clattered to the ground next to my head, and they all scattered like quail. I was dumped, face first to the ground, unceremoniously, as my two captors beat feet for the woods. The sounds of shouts and boots and the occasional gunshot surrounded me, and I lay still as I hoped not to be shot out of hand. Eventually, a pair of boots came into my peripheral vision, and my hands were jerked back into flex cuffs as I was lifted up so the officers could have a look at me. A half hour later, and I'm in a detective's office with a warm cup of coffee and a recently freed wrist. We've been tracking these guys for years. They come to Atlanta the most often of any of their other haunts, and it leads me to believe that most of them are from here. About once every 3 years, we find a body at the state park. They take their organs, scribble some runes on the Vic, and just leave them there. Usually the animals have found them before we do. You're actually the first victim we've managed to find alive. It's a wonder we found you in time. He told me a lot of things that evening. He told me that this Green Man they all worship, some Eastern European god or something, and how they believe that if they don't make a sacrifice, he'll bring terrible fury down upon them. They always make a sacrifice right before Halloween, and it's always some random person they've probably known for less than a year. I gave him my girlfriend's name and the name of the guy from the airport, but he told me neither one checked out. Both were likely fake names, used to cover their tracks. Despite messaging my girlfriend, all I've received is a notice that the number has been canceled. So that's where I stand now. I'm afraid to go home because she has a house key. I'm afraid to go to my parents' house because she's met them. I don't know who to talk to, where to turn, or how many of our friends are involved in this little cult too. The detective told me to be very careful after all, because while they didn't catch my girlfriend, they did catch somebody. He took me to a little room with a one-way mirror in it and had me identify a pudgy guy in a robe. He was talking to another detective in a very animated way, the man staying calm despite the amount of flailing he was doing. He asked if this was the guy that my girlfriend had been talking to, the one they called Master, and I nodded. The man suddenly leaned forward and yelled at the detective, who sat back quickly despite the man's hands being chained to the table. Spit flew from his mouth as he yelled. Even through the glass, I could hear what he was screaming. "You don't get it. You idiots just don't get it. We aren't worshiping the Green Man. We're all here to protect you from him. If this false sacrifice isn't received, then he will come. He'll come and he will kill. You have to release me. The sacrifice must be completed." That was about the time 2 other officers ran in and restrained him, but his message was clear enough. If anyone reading this has any information, I'd suggest you go to the police. These Green Man guys will have to strike again soon. If they believe that their actions keep us safe, if their delusion is something that must be accomplished, then any one of you may be in danger. I was groomed for 6 months, kept safe like a pig for the slaughter, but they don't have time to be so choosy anymore. The Green Man must be appeased, and soon, lest we suffer his wrath. Who knows which one of you might find yourself beside the fire this year? "Oh my God, there it is! Stop the car, Jacob!" Lily exclaimed as the house she saw in the ad came into view. Lily and Jacob had been in the same neighborhood for most of their 12-year marriage. They had liked the area when they moved in, but the peaceful neighborhood had seen its share of crime and decline lately. The straw that broke the camel's back and made them decide to move had been 3 nights ago when they'd been out to dinner. They'd been celebrating their 12-year anniversary when someone broke into their house and ransacked the place. Anything of value that wasn't locked in the safe was taken. When the police finally got there, they acted as though they couldn't care less. There was absolutely no help. So the next day, Lily went online to find a new house within their price range. Lo and behold, she found a lovely house a few neighborhoods over, on the nicer side of town. It was a closer commute to Jacob's work and was well within their price range. Lily wasted no time calling the number on the ad and setting up a walkthrough. They had set it up for that Saturday morning, but when Saturday arrived, Lily had gotten a short text telling her to go ahead and have a look at the place and sending her the code to the key box on the door. The owners said that they wouldn't be able to make it, but if they wanted to take a look, they could go right ahead, just to be sure to return the key when they were done and let them know what they thought. Jacob was very reluctant and wanted Lily to reschedule for a time when the owner could join them, but Lily wouldn't hear of it. She threatened to go herself, but that seemed to make up Jacob's mind, and he agreed to come with her. As they pulled into the driveway, Lily could hardly contain herself. She jumped out of the car and rushed to the porch, stretching her arms and taking a deep breath. The scent of gardenias filled her nose, the smell reminding her of summers she spent at her grandmother's house as a child. In fact, the front porch reminded her a little of her grandparents' house, too. The long porch stretched the whole front of the house, and it had several weather-worn rockers and a swing hanging from a pair of chains. Had her grandmother had a swing like that? Had Lily sat on it and swung when she was a little girl? Had she gone too high, perhaps? And Jacob leaned out the window, his hand over the phone. "Sweetheart, it's work. I gotta take this. I'll catch up with you as soon as I get done." Lily gave him a tart look and shrugged. She took one more deep breath before mounting the porch and approaching the front door. She had seen it on Zillow when she was looking for houses, and it had been one of the biggest reasons she wanted the place. It had 8 squares on the front. There was red, green, and green again, just like her grandparents' door. She could remember standing in front of the door as a little girl, feeling excited as she waited for it to open. Since her grandmother wasn't going to come to let her in this time, she put in the code and got the key to open the door. The door opened with a little creak, and Lily stepped inside with a broad grin. Jacob looked up at Lily as she walked into the house, thinking of how beautiful she looked as she walked past the threshold. He couldn't have known this, but it would be the last time he'd ever see her. As Lily stepped into the front hall of the house, she felt a bit of déjà vu. She felt like she was coming home, as if she'd been here 1,000 times before. On her right was a large archway that led into a sitting room. Lily decided to check out that room first, since it was the closest, and there was a window so she could look out and see if Jacob was coming in. As she walked into the room, she felt a strange change in the atmosphere, the whole thing beginning to shift. Lily walked to the window to call out to Jacob, but when she looked outside, his car was no longer in the driveway. Instead, there were several familiar-looking vehicles. Was that her parents' car from when she was 9? And that car looked like Aunt Judy's car. That truck parked on the street looked just like her grandparents'. But that was impossible. She'd watched her mom sell that car when she was 10. What was going on here? As she stood there confused, she heard a voice calling to her. Lily turned around, but she was no longer alone. Her family filled the couch and chairs. The room looked just like her grandma's sitting room from when she was a kid. She could remember seeing everyone seated like this once before, and the memory made her feel kind of crawly. As a child, they had often sat in her grandmother's sitting room during holidays or special occasions, but something was off today. Something wasn't quite how she remembered it. Everyone looked as though they had been crying. She didn't remember this scene from her childhood quite like this. Something was very wrong. As she abandoned her place next to the window, she walked as though in a haze to where her mother sat. She looked up as Lily approached and patted the couch next to her, motioning for her to sit. Her mother put an arm around her, not an altogether familiar feeling, and when Lily spoke, her voice was that of a very young child. "What's wrong, Mama?" Lily asked, looking around at everyone and seeing tears welling up in their eyes. Her father spoke first, though. "Lilybug, there's been an accident. Your grandmother fell down the basement stairs. She didn't make it." As those words left his mouth, everyone began to wail, and Lily felt her mother press her face against her head. Lily, however, sat speechless, trying to process what she'd heard. This wasn't how she remembered this, was it? Lily got up from her spot on the couch and began to pace. Her memory of that day was fuzzy, but as she walked between the couch and the window, it began to solidify. She remembered her family telling her that her grandma had gone to live in Boca, not that she was dead. When Lily turned back to confront her mother, though, she found that she was alone in the sitting room again. The furniture, her family, everything was gone. The room was as it was when she walked through the front door, and Lily shuddered as a palpable chill ran through her. "Looks like a goose walked over your grave," she heard her grandmother say, and it was as if she were just in the next room. Lily rushed to the front door to get out of the house, wanting nothing so much as to smell the gardenias again, before she jumped into the car and told Jacob to drive away. She should have listened to him. She should have waited, but she'd been so eager to see this place. It had brought back so many memories, so many times that made her feel young again. But that was gone now. She didn't care how dangerous their neighborhood was. She would gladly live there for the rest of time if it meant that she could leave this mausoleum. The door, however, was gone. The entryway was still there, but the wall where the front door should be was a blank. She ran back to the sitting room window and started pounding on it, trying to get Jacob's attention. His car was back, and he was sitting in the front seat, but he didn't seem to hear her. "Jacob, please, help me!" she screamed, but Jacob didn't answer. He glanced up, but then looked back down to the phone, talking with Terry or Mark or whoever it was calling him from work. He couldn't see her. He didn't know she was stuck. And suddenly Lily realized she was alone. If she was going to get out of here, she'd have to do it herself. Lily thought she might as well look for another way out. and as if summoned, she noticed the hallway that ran opposite the sitting room. There would be a bathroom down there, if she remembered right, and some cold water on her face sounded exactly like what she needed. She headed to the bathroom, but as she got closer, she felt that strange shivering again. As she came closer, she could hear the sound of sloshing water, as if someone was splashing frantically in the bathtub. Lily stepped cautiously to the door that separated the hall from the small bathroom, and peeked in as the wooden barrier made a funny squeaking sound. She could see her father knelt down at the side of the tub, and she could see him holding her mother's head under the water. Lily stepped back, the door opening to give her a terrible view of her mother's drowning. But it all seemed wrong. That wasn't how she remembered that horrible time when she was 12. Was it? Lily remembered her father trying to help her mother out of the tub when she'd had a seizure. She remembered him trying, but not being able to save her. This new reality of what really happened hurt her brain more than her heart, and Lily tore off in a mad scramble to be away from the awful sound of her mother drowning again and again. Lily ran to the staircase that lay beyond the foyer and darted up the steps without thinking of where she was going. As she ran into one of the bedrooms, her mind still reeling from the scene below, the feeling of déjà vu came yet again. As she turned to take in the room that she had just run into, she could see a crib with a mobile twirling overhead. The smiling yellow ducks spun drunkenly, but even their placidity couldn't bring joy to the scene. This was her son's room. No, she pleaded, not this memory. Her husband walked into the room, holding their 3-week-old son to his chest. It should have brought her joy to see him again, till she realized her wonderful husband was holding little Jonathan's face to his chest, muffling the sound of his cries. He didn't seem to notice her watching him, didn't seem to care at all that he was snuffing the life from what would be their only child. After the baby had stopped crying, Jacob quietly kissed him on his little cheek and placed him in his crib. But no, that's not how it had gone at all. Lily's memory was fuzzy, but she remembered Jacob holding their baby and comforting him till he fell asleep. When she had woken up and noticed that Jonathan hadn't woken up for his feeding yet, she went to his room and found him cold and blue in his crib. She screamed for her husband, and Jacob had rushed to her side to find her cradling their poor baby as if she could bring him back to life. They called 911, but when the EMTs arrived, they said it was too late. His death was stated as SIDS, and the two had been left to mourn their loss. Lily didn't know how much more she could take in this house. She slid down the wall, crying as the crib vanished, and the room once again was empty. Lily sat there for a few minutes, getting her bearings. Then she got up and slowly walked down the stairs. She didn't want to see any more, but she knew that she had to get out of this house if she intended to have any sanity left when she escaped. As Jacob sat in the front seat, talking to his boss, he realized that Lily hadn't come out of the house yet. It had been at least an hour since he'd told her he'd catch up with her, and she should have been able to see the whole place twice in an hour. He looked up at the window that overlooked the front yard, hoping to see her looking out at him, but no such luck. "Listen, Mark, we can handle the rest of this on Monday. I need to check on Lily. She's alone in the house we're both supposed to be looking at, and I'm getting a little worried about her." "Okay, that's fine. See you Monday. Bye." As Jacob climbed out of the car and walked towards the porch, he could smell a familiar smell. He stopped in the walkway and took a deep whiff, savoring the scent he hadn't smelled in years. It was bourbon and cigar smoke, and it reminded him of the Saturday night poker games at his dad's house. Dad's poker games had been full of both, and Jacob remembered peeking in as a kid so he could watch the festivities. As he got to the door and tried to open it to join his wife, the door was locked. He knocked, wondering why she had locked it behind herself if she wanted him to come take a look. "Lily, let me in, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took so long, but you know how much of a windbag Mark can be." But Lily didn't respond. He knocked a little louder, but still no response. At this point, Jacob began to worry that something had happened to her. He pounded on the door, his fears coming back at the thought of what could be happening to his wife. Hadn't he thought this sounded like a great way to get robbed or kidnapped? He didn't know this guy from Adam, and he had just let his wife go in alone. What had he been thinking? "Lily!" he yelled as he beat on the door. But no answer came. Lily walked down the steps and into the basement as if in a trance. She was numb from the torture that this house had put her through, and just wanted to be outside in the sun again before it could show her anything else. As she descended the basement stairs, the air shifted again, and she steadied herself for what was next. She opened her eyes to see that she was in her own basement, but something was off. The shelves where she kept the Christmas ornaments were pushed away from the wall. As she walked over to see why it was pulled away, she saw a trap door under where the shelf usually was. The door was open, and Lily could hear something down there. Whatever it was crying out softly, as though too weak to scream. Jacob, worried and a little angry, decided to try to find another way in. He walked around to the back of the house, but as he came to the gate, he too felt that overpowering sense of déjà vu. When he got to the backyard, he saw a swing set that looked lonely in the open space. It looked like his own swing set from when he was a kid, and he walked curiously towards it. When he reached the swing, Jacob sat down and looked at the back door. He realized it was his childhood door, and scrunched up his eyes as he tried to make sense of it. He'd spent a lot of time on his swing while his dad talked with his mom. As he watched the window by the door, Jacob saw people inside talking loudly, their silhouettes performing sad little plays for this child's eyes to watch. But this isn't how he remembered this happening. It had been just another fight, his dad starting it like always. The mailman had been sitting at their kitchen table when he came home, a cold towel on his head, as he drank a glass of his mom's lemonade. He had nearly collapsed on the front lawn in the heat, and though his father had smiled when he saw the man cooling off in his kitchen, Jacob had seen his mother flinch when he looked at her. His father had waited till after dinner to tell his son to go play out back while they talked, and his mother had seemed to beg him with her eyes not to leave. Jacob watched as his dad reached for something on the counter, and his mom's silhouette backed away slowly. His dad lunged with a sudden rage, and Jacob imagined he could hear the frying pan connect with the side of her head. His dad's dark afterimage stood over her for a few minutes, the pan coming down a few more times until sanity seemed to reassert itself. He stood up, the image realizing that it had talked a little too vigorously this time. Jacob could almost see the lack of confidence in the outline as it weighed its options. When it looked out at him, Jacob realized his father meant to make him an accomplice to his folly. "Jacob," his father yelled from the doorway, "get me a shovel from the shed. Then I need you to get in the truck and wait for me." Jacob hopped dutifully off the swing, with much smaller feet than his own. He was horrified at his blind fanaticism, but understood it all too well. As he ran to the shed to fetch the shovel, he realized that the memory of the night his mother left him wasn't the way he remembered it. Dad wasn't planning a garden to surprise her with, and Mom hadn't left them for a fella who ran the register at Ralph's. He did what he was told, though, and grabbed the shovel. He gave it to his dad and ran to the truck as his father began grunting at something that must have been very heavy in the kitchen. It couldn't have been his mother. Jacob's mom ate like a bird. Surely he wouldn't have strained so much to lift her. As soon as Jacob got in the truck, everything became hazy again. He realized he was back in his own car, his father's truck gone. As Jacob sat there, he began to cry. He didn't want to cry. He hadn't cried in so long, but found the tears just wouldn't stop. He was terrified of what had just happened. He was scared of a man he had buried 10 years ago. He was grieving for his mother in a way that he had never managed to when he was 8. Above all else, Jacob was worried about his wife. "Hello?" Lily whispered as she descended the stairs. "Who's down there? Do you need help?" she whispered, understanding the irony of her question a little too late. As she spoke, the whimpering stopped. It was dark and damp down here, the floor made of packed earth, and the smell of dirt and iron filled her nose. As she felt around for a light switch, she could hear something shifting across the room. Lily paused for a second, trying to listen to what it was. It was hard to hear over the sound of her heart beating in her ears, and Lily was afraid of getting snuck up on down here by the specters in the house again. She found a small chain hanging from a bulb in the ceiling. As she pulled it, the small light lit the room pathetically, but what she saw still terrified her. This was not any memory that she had ever had. She looked to where the sound was coming from and found herself staring back at her from a dirty mattress on the floor. She was battered and beaten, starved, with one hand attached to the wall by a metal cuff. Lily, in shock, started to back away, but heard someone walking into the basement. She quickly turned off the light and backed up against the wall, praying the darkness would hide her. As the steps got closer, Lily felt around for something to defend herself with, in case the person came downstairs. As she slid her hand across the cold dirt floor, she found what felt like a pipe, and picked it up as quickly as possible, holding it to her chest. A few moments later, she could hear heavy footsteps coming down the cellar stairs. She closed her eyes and prayed she wouldn't be seen. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cellar. She was standing in front of the front door. Jacob got himself together and returned to the backyard to find a way in. The swing set was gone, as was the shed. The back door was no longer his childhood back door either. This door was white, with a blue ruffle at the top of the window, and the realization made him feel a little bit better. He pushed up the 3 steps to the door and turned the knob. The door opened easily, and as he walked over the threshold into the kitchen, he felt the shift again. He was in his dad's kitchen, and his father was talking to the police officer. "Mr. Daniels, do you know of anywhere your ex-wife would have gone?" the officer asked, tapping his pencil on an ancient-looking notebook. "No, officer. Like I've told you before, she called me 3 weeks ago asking to pick up our son because she needed a break from him. He can be a handful, so I agreed and went over to get my boy. She didn't tell me where she was going or when she'd come back. Jacob, go on to your room now and play. Let me and these officers finish our conversation." He had been 9 when the officers came to question his father. Jacob knew better than to disagree with the old man, but he knew that his mother had made no such request. At the time, it had seemed that maybe Daddy had been confused, but Jacob found out later that his mother had divorced him and left town with someone else. She had never tried to see Jacob again, and his father telling the police a lie had always seemed a little weird to him. One look at his father's flinty eyes, however, had told him to do as he was told, and Jacob ran for the staircase in the living room. He was walking towards the doorway when he looked back towards his father, only to find that everything was gone. The kitchen was empty now, save for him. Lily reached for the handle of the door, turning the knob with trepidation. Was this another trick? Some new game for the house to tease her with? She had never given up hope that she would get out, but she thought she might have believed the house would keep her here forever anyway. Would they even find her body, she wondered? Would they know it was her if they did? The door swung open, and Lily was again assaulted by the smell of gardenias. She came down the steps, running over the walk, and found the car exactly where she'd left it. She almost saw Jacob sitting there, the phone still pressed against his ear, but when she stuck her head into the window, she found the car was empty, the keys still hanging in the ignition. Lily wasn't sure what to make of this, and as she sat in the passenger seat, her mind started trying to make sense of what she'd seen. She realized her marriage, her whole life, was full of these little lies. Her mind made up memories to protect her from reality, but the house showed her the truth. She remembered what her father had done to her mother and what her husband did to their son, and she felt disgust well up inside her. "How could I be so stupid?" she whispered. Tears coming unbidden. That still didn't explain why she had seen herself down in that cellar in such a state. As Lily thought about it, she realized she needed answers. She climbed over the driver's side and turned the key. The engine came to life, and Lily peeled the tires as she headed home. She wouldn't feel safe in that house until she checked the basement to be sure of what was there. Jacob would be angry if he came back to find the car missing, and if such a place existed in her home, she would likely find herself in there if he made it home. Jacob called out to Lily, hoping to find her safe and sound as he made it to the stairs. He could hear someone upstairs, and he kept calling for his wife as he ascended. He could hear someone crying in the bedroom to the right of him, and he was afraid that she had gotten hurt, or worse, that someone had hurt her. "Sweetheart, is that you? Are you okay?" he called out. He slowly opened the door and peeked in to see himself holding their son. His wife cried as she watched him smothering their son. The baby had been crying for hours, and Jacob couldn't handle that high-pitched squeal anymore. He snapped, and it was something he regretted every day. He had tried to move from beneath the shadow of his father, especially after what he'd done to Lily, but it seemed that you never quite forgot the old ways, or the old lessons. He reached for Lily as she lay there crying, but as his hands passed through her, she turned to dust beneath his fingers. Everything melted away like dandelion fluff, and suddenly, the room was empty. As he backed out of the room, he heard sobbing from the bedroom across the hall again. Jacob's hands shook as he reached for the knob, but he had to find Lily and make her understand how sorry he was for their son's death. He peeked inside as the door creaked open and could see his own bedroom. Lily was crying as she spoke to someone on the phone. She was talking about, oh God, she was talking about his little secret. She had found the root cellar, the shame he had hidden for years, and now she knew everything. He charged in, trying to stop her, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, it all just melted away. Jacob's father had often said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Jacob supposed he'd been right. Lily had taken a lot of convincing, a lot of mental conditioning, but Stockholm Syndrome was an interesting thing. She never remembered how she came to be in Jacob's basement after he took her from her work one evening. She never questioned how they'd been married for 12 years when he had only snatched her 7 years ago. She had accepted that there were no pictures of their wedding because of the fire that had burned their apartment. She had accepted that their son had died of SIDS too, though he thought maybe that one had been harder to swallow than the rest. In many ways, it was like her mind created answers for questions before they were asked. But the sound of it, she had been doing that for most of her childhood. Jacob's childhood had been fraught, but Lily's had been something from a pulp novel. She'd been happy to forget, happy to cloud her own mind with misty memories and rose-colored tint. But this damn house had probably shown her all sorts of things that pulled the wool from her eyes. As Jacob sat in the empty room, he wondered if prison would be worse than living in this warped memory for the rest of his life. The whispers from the house told him that he'd never get to know. There would be no open door waiting for someone like Jacob. The house had a new toy, a new rat in its cage, and Jacob would never bask in the sun again. There once was a man with ears, you see, in the dead of the night he'll come for thee. He'll drag you into the woods to scream, and there your bones he'll gnaw. Soon shall the bunny man come to take you away from your dad and mum. Soon shall the bunny man come, and your soul shall belong to him. "Stop it, Catherine!" I'd scream, but Catherine just cackled and sang it all the louder. I can still remember my sister's face because of that ghoulish smile she wore while she tormented me. We grew up in New Zealand, so the shanty was something old that we changed for our own purposes. Many of the kids sang it, but my sister was the first to adopt it into something different from the original. A few kids had added some creative lyrics to the original song, usually something about farty men or something, but Catherine had turned it into a song about the Bunny Man. She was forbidden from singing it at school. By our parents and teachers, and she took it as an excuse to sing it for me at every opportunity. It was usually sung low, under her breath, so my parents couldn't hear it, so she could deny it when I began crying about it. It was in poor taste anyway. The Bunny Man may have been an urban legend, but the man going around kidnapping children was very real. That summer, 13 children had gone missing in the city we lived in. All of them were from poor families like ours, who lived in tenement buildings, much like ours. They always disappeared in the middle of the night after being lured out of their houses, and there was always some sign left behind that tied them together. Whether it was spray painted on their door, the fence behind their house, or the sides of the building they lived in, the calling card was always left in plain white spray paint for the police to find. A white rabbit head in a white circle, the sign of the Bunny Man. My sister had started humming the little shanty after the 7th kid had gone missing. I had heard her in her room, working through the lyrics as we did homework. She would hum them to herself in a distracted way that people often do while they're trying to figure something out. As she scratched away at the math problem, she would argue with herself and make corrections to the grisly little shanty she was constructing. I would shudder to myself as I heard what she was writing, and I think I might have become her horrified little barometer. The more I shuddered, the more lyrics I heard that stayed in place. By the time school started again in August, her shanty had taken form, and she began her reign of terror. Catherine and I were 2 years apart. I had started 6th grade, and she had started 8th, and she seemed to delight in terrorizing the other girls in my class with her Bunny Man song. She would walk behind groups of students, humming the tune at first as they walked from class or to lunch. Then she would begin singing the words to herself, low at first, building volume, until a few of them started to hear what she was singing and become noticeably upset. Then she would run up behind the group, caterwauling the last verse as she sent them screaming and running in all directions. That's how she had earned herself a suspension from school and a grounding from our parents. That's why she was home that night, the night of December 15th, the night the Bunny Man did indeed come. We were both grounded that night, actually. My sister was grounded after being suspended from school for her Bunny Man shenanigans, but she didn't much care. She was happy to put off schoolwork and watch TV all day and suffer the wrath of our parents. I, however, was grounded for encouraging these antics by saying I had seen the Bunny Man. It wasn't a joke, though. I wasn't trying to encourage Catherine in her bad behavior. I had woken up for the 6th night in a row, hearing someone humming that shanty and going to the window to see who it was. I couldn't actually be hearing anyone, I realize now. Our loft was on the 5th floor, looking out on a vacant lot and the road behind the building. There was no way I should be able to hear anything. I could, though. I can clearly remember hearing that shanty, hummed in a gravelly baritone that sounded as though it were right outside the window. The first few times I heard it, I went to the window and looked out on the lot. In the moonlight, he was standing there, in the road, a man in a dingy gray rabbit costume, his eyes glowing yellow and his ears cocked almost jauntily. My parents would hear me screaming and come running into the room to see what was going on. They would find me on the floor, screaming and pointing out the window, always gibbering about the Bunny Man. After the 3rd night, I didn't even go to the window. I would lie in bed and sob as the shanty bore its way into my brain. I would sob and call for them, screaming about the damn Bunny Man, until finally, my father couldn't take it anymore. That's why both of us were grounded on the night in question, the night our parents went out. It was supposed to be a family night. We were supposed to go out and have a real family meal, see a movie, maybe get some ice cream. Instead, my father had been using it as a punishment for my sister after she'd gotten in trouble. We 3 would go out and have fun while she stayed home and did not. My mother, however, thought this was a little harsh, and she had been pleading with him to reconsider. This had made him a little short, and after being woken up by my screaming all week, he had reached his limit. He grounded me as well, thinking I was trying to egg my sister on with all this Bunny Man nonsense, and announced that he and my mother were going on a date instead. "We will be back at 10. You two are to be in bed by 8:30. If I come in and you're still awake, you will be severely punished." Then they left, and for a few hours we'd gotten along pretty well. Catherine made dinner, heating up some canned pasta in the microwave, and then we'd watch some TV as the sun set and the evening wore on. It wasn't until 8, when I got off the couch and started for bed, that she started in on her old ways. She asked what I was doing, and when I told her I was going to get ready for bed, she asked me why. "You heard, Dad. If we're still up when he gets here, we're going to get in trouble." "Pfft, probably just scared the bunny man will hear you awake and come get you." "I am not," I lied. "R2, you're in such a hurry to go to sleep, so the bunny man will come and take you away." She leaned towards me, grinning that awful grin. "Oh, there once was a man with ears, you see." I put my hands over my ears and started running away as she sang all the louder and chased me. "In the dead of the night, he'll come for thee." "Catherine, stop it," I sobbed. We were running up the hall, and as I wheeled into my room, I tried to slam the door and lock her out. She battered the door aside and bore down on me, grinning and singing as I cowered beneath the window. I was covering my head with my arms, sobbing uncontrollably as I tried to block her out. She stalked towards me, bellowing the song now and scritching her hands like claws as she walked towards me. "Soon shall the bunny man come to bring..." But she stopped suddenly, and as the silence stretched on, I opened my eyes and looked up to find her looking out the window as she loomed over me. She was staring out the window, transfixed by whatever she saw there, and this new game was almost scarier than the shanty. Her face held a look I was unused to seeing. She was startled, unsure of what she was looking at, but it also appeared that there was terror there. Something outside the window was really spooking her, and I scrambled up to peek under her arm so I could see too. It seemed I was peeking into one of my nightmares. Standing in the road, right under a streetlight, was a man in a tattered gray bunny costume. It wasn't like a Halloween costume, some of which looked like pajamas more than costume, but it was a full suit of coarse-looking gray fur. The fur was matted and dark in places, kinky and tangled like a stuffed animal that needs to be brushed. The head was obscured by a black hood, some kind of costume hood that just slid over the head, and the face was a flat black nothing as it stared at our building. No, not at our building, as it stared at us. On top of the hood, someone had stapled a pair of thin, emaciated gray rabbit ears, one of which bent at an almost jaunty angle. He stood on the street and stared up at us, my sister and I frozen in terror at the sight of the legendary Bunny Man. All at once, I heard a gruff, tuneless humming from the street that sounded startlingly like Catherine's shanty. He had no words to go along with it. He only hummed and stared, and I think we both felt an almost magnetic desire to stare back at him. It was like the scene in a scary movie where the monster's out in the open, and you pray that none of the characters are stupid enough to go confront him. In your heart, though, you know that one of them is. Catherine, it appeared, was that one. I caught her by the arm as she turned from the window. She looked back at me, her face full of confused anger and unsure deliberation. She was clearly at odds with herself, and my sister was not someone who was used to being unsure of her actions. She was a brat, and she was a terror, but I had always kind of believed that everything she did was a calculated course of risk and reward. This was something else, though. This was her acting against her will. After all, she had sung about the Bunny Man coming for others, and now it appeared he had come for her instead. She jerked her hand away and left the room. When I heard the front door open and close, I moved back to the window, waiting for her to appear. The Bunny Man went right on humming, right on watching, as though he was trying to call me as well. I felt the pull. Really, I did, but my fear kept me rooted to the spot. I clutched the windowsill tightly, the paint chipping a little as my fingers gripped it, and I would find splinters under my nails the next day, though I didn't notice them at the time. Then, she appeared in the backyard, walking like a sleepwalker, and going to him as she vaulted the chain-link fence between the yards and the road. He reached for her, and Now I could hear both of them humming that hateful song and staring up at me. It filled my head like a hive of bees, and I knelt my head against the glass as I prayed that it would stop. There would be no way I could resist if they both sang, and I could feel the pull as they tried to drag me out the door as well. After about 60 seconds of them humming and staring, she took his hand, and the two of them disappeared up the road. My parents came home 3 hours later to find me curled up on the floor of my bedroom, sobbing and gibbering as I rocked and mumbled about the bunny man. They searched the house, thinking that my sister had gone too far. She had finally scared me too much, and now she was going to have to answer for it. As my mother sat with me, trying to console me, my father tore up the house looking for Catherine. He clearly expected her to be hiding somewhere inside, probably running when she heard the front door open. When he couldn't find her inside, he went looking for her at her friends' houses. Their parents told him, often grumpily, that they hadn't seen Catherine, but they would call if they did. He got worried, going to look up and down the street for her, expecting her to be hidden somewhere in fear of retribution. All the while, Mom tried to calm me down and get a straight answer out of me. After about an hour, I started talking about the bunny man and how he had come to get us, how Catherine had left with him. She started to get angry, telling me that she was tired of hearing about the damn bunny man. However, when I refused to deviate from my story, she started to take me a little more seriously. The police were called, the neighborhood was searched, people were questioned, and the woods were combed for the next week and a half. No sign was ever found of my sister or the bunny man. No sign was ever found of any of the children abducted by the bunny man that year. That was 15 years ago now. The bunny man took only one more child that year, a 7-year-old, on Christmas Eve, and then was never seen again. They never found the remains of any of the children he kidnapped, and no one was ever arrested in connection with the kidnappings. There was never any bunny suit found or a murder weapon discovered in the woods. Whoever was doing this had just stopped. I'm 27 now. My own daughter is 8. Her dad's not really in the picture, which leaves a lot of time for just us. I was getting ready for bed one night, Emily playing in her room before bedtime, when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The tune, a familiar tune that everyone in town knows, crept up the hallway. The tune wasn't what stopped me, though. It was the lyrics that made me shiver. The words she sang transported me back in time, and suddenly I was 12 years old again, watching my older sister creep towards me as she sang the same hateful words. However, the voice that sang them was childish, lilting the words with no more care than she would have had for any other nursery rhyme. There once was a man with ears, you see, in the dead of the night he'll come for thee. He'll drag you into the woods so green, and there your bones he'll gnaw. Soon shall the bunny man come to take you away from your dad and mum. Soon shall the bunny man come, and your soul shall belong to him. I peeked around the corner of the doorframe and saw her on the floor playing with blocks, oblivious to what she was singing. Emily, where did you hear that song? She got up and walked to her bed, giggling as she crawled under the covers. From the funny lady. What funny lady? I asked, bending to tuck her in, but finding my hands incapable. She comes and sings at night sometimes, after you go to sleep. I'll wake you up so you can hear her next time. When I go to the window, she's standing on the street. She has ears on top of her hood, Mommy. Isn't that silly? I told her it was very silly, but I didn't feel like laughing in the least bit. Emily's in my bed now, sleeping soundly, as I pin this warning to anyone whose children have heard this song too. I'm afraid it's not an urban legend. It's not a hoax. The bunny man is real, and it seems that he's not alone anymore. He's coming for our children again, and I, for one, don't mean to lose my daughter to this creep or his children. As I lay here writing, I can almost hear it on the breeze, as if someone's singing it outside my window. Emily is stirring in her sleep. It appears it may not just have been in my head. I fear it may already be too late. I didn't want the sweater in the first place. From the first time I laid eyes on the damn thing, I knew it would haunt me until the day I died. I first saw it in a thrift store window when I was 10 years old. It was a lumpy green thing made out of thick yarn, an ugly monstrosity that looked like someone's grandmother had knitted badly. As much as I hated it, I was also drawn to it. Even as I stared, I thought I could see a pair of big, goggly eyes in the pattern. Two sharp teeth floating amongst the swirls of thread seemed eager to bite me as I slid it on. The arms ended in little tassels that looked like claws, sharp claws that looked like needles. I hated it, but I was drawn to it in that way that children are drawn to anything that might end their perceived immortality. Mom must have noticed my interest. 2 weeks later, just as the autumn chill began to rise, she gave it to me one morning so I could wear it to school. She pulled it out from behind her back, flourishing it like the end of some magic trick. She smiled hugely, clearly thinking she had something I really wanted. My stomach dropped when I saw it, and I was again filled with a sense of dread that she must have picked up on. "It's the sweater you liked so much," she said, looking a little hurt. "You really seemed taken with it when you saw it back at the store." Mom didn't have the money to buy me much. Dad had left when I was a baby, and she worked as a waitress to put food on the table and a roof over my head. We didn't have a lot of money for presents, and I could tell that however much this sweater had cost was too much for me to act anything but grateful. I pulled it on, not really wanting it on my skin, but pretending it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It was made out of scratchy wool that I just knew at first glance would make me feel too warm. It rubbed at my skin like steel wool as it settled on my arms. It just felt wrong as it sat against my smooth skin, and I immediately wanted to take it off. It felt like there were bugs in it. As I walked to the door, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe roaches or earwigs had gotten into the fabric. She walked me to the bus stop, all the while smiling at me as I pretended the sweater wasn't the worst thing I'd ever worn. As the bus pulled away from the curve, I yanked it off and stuffed it in my backpack. My friend Mark looked at me strangely. "New sweater?" "Mom found it for me, but it's just about the most uncomfortable sweater ever." "I thought it looked kinda cool," Mark said, "like Slimer from the Ghostbusters." The movies were pretty popular around this time, and I had to admit that it did look pretty ghoulish. The pattern on the front, big teeth and bug eyes, did make it look a little like the green ghost from the movie, and we talked about it all the way to school. I forgot all about the sweater until I got home that afternoon. I found it crumpled at the bottom of my backpack when I got started on my homework. I took it out and laid it over my desk chair. As I sat to do my homework, though, it began to itch at me. I took it and tossed it in a chair by the closet door instead, getting back to work. Even having it against my skin made me feel weird, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at it as I did my homework. It felt like it was looking at me somehow, staring at me with those huge bug eyes, and I felt haunted by it as it sat placidly. When Mom came home a few hours later, she seemed happy to see the sweater. "I knew you would like it. Was it warm enough today?" "Yeah, it was just right," I lied. I finished my homework and went downstairs to help with dinner. Typically, I would have sat in my room or watched television till dinner was made, but tonight, I just wanted an excuse to be out of my room, away from the sweater. My room felt invaded every time I looked at it, and I just wanted to be anywhere but there for a few hours. I didn't think about it again until it was time for bed. I came into my room, pajama bottoms and white undershirt on, with my mouth still feeling minty from the toothpaste. I was ready to climb into bed when I saw the sweater again. For some reason, I just couldn't stand looking at it anymore. I picked it up, the coarse fabric scritching at my hands, and tossed it under the bed. I knew it meant nothing, a meaningless gesture, but I didn't want it watching me while I slept. Mom came in and kissed my forehead. "Good night, honey," she said as she turned off the lights and closed the door. I burrowed down under the covers and started getting comfortably sleepy. It had been a long day, with another one to follow, and as I began to edge towards sleep, I started to hear a weird noise from somewhere in the room. It sounded like someone dragging wire across the hardwood, and as I focused my attention on it, I could hear the sound sliding across the boards. I sat in my bed and looked for it, that harsh slithering that wound its way over the flooring. As I cast my eyes over by the chair, I saw the source of the noise. It was the sweater. It was sitting on the chair where I had thrown it earlier, leering at me with its toothy grin. It couldn't be there. I had thrown it under the bed, but there it sat, as though I'd never grabbed it in the first place. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I hadn't thrown it. Maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing, and now I was just scaring myself. I rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. As I tossed and turned, though, I could almost feel those bug eyes looking at me. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it all out. As I lay there, I imagined I could hear that wire dragging across the wood again. It was like the scratching of claws times 10, and I could hear it going under my bed and towards the wall. I peeked out from under the covers and looked towards the chair, making sure that hideous sweater was still there and not responsible for the noises. The chair was empty, though. I sat straight up and peered around the semi-dark, searching for the sweater. It couldn't have moved. It was a sweater, a stupid sweater, and even my 10-year-old brain knew the sweater didn't just get up and move around on its own. I looked over the edge of the bed, seeing nothing, and hesitantly hung upside down so I could glance under the bed. In my 10-year-old brain, that was where the monsters lived, and this sweater had become a monster now. I peeked, afraid to see it, but it wasn't there. Only a few toys and some dirty clothes greeted me. I looked back at the chair, still finding it empty, and snuggled down under the covers so I could get some sleep. I awoke in the morning to a terrible pain in my arm. The sweater was in bed with me, curled around my arm as though it had gotten tangled on me in the night, and I wrenched it off violently. I didn't want it to touch me. I didn't want it to contact my skin. As I came free, I saw the source of the pain. On my forearm, on the inside of my arm, was what looked like a bite. As I inspected it in the dewy morning light, I felt sure I could pick out individual teeth marks on the flesh of my arm. I looked frantically at the crumpled green garment in the corner and suddenly felt sure that it was the source of the bite. I ran downstairs to show my mom, who was just starting to get breakfast things together. She looked at the bite and declared it a rash. "Probably from your new sweater," she said, and I could hear real sadness in her voice. She still believed that I really liked that ghastly thing, and the thought that it had caused me pain made her sad. She said she would wash it today after school and have it back to me by tomorrow, and I remember hoping that it shrank in the wash. I thought all day about the terrible garment coming back too small or shredded by some fluke, and the idea brought me some little amount of joy throughout the day. When I got home, however, I heard the washing machine in full swing and found a note on the table saying that Mom had gone to get groceries. I figured she put the sweater in with the load and went upstairs to start my homework. Mark and Davey wanted to ride bikes later, and I knew that if I got my math done before dinner, I'd be able to go riding with them before the sun went down. When I opened the door, I was startled by the green sweater sitting on the chair where I had left it last night. I was angry at myself for a moment. Why was I so afraid of this stupid sweater? I grabbed it up, yarn digging into my hands like steel wool, and took it to the laundry room. I opened the washer and threw it inside, slamming the lid closed and stomping back upstairs to start my homework. I finished quickly, and when Mom got home, I went outside to play. I spent the afternoon riding bikes and jumping dirt ramps with my friends, and as the streetlights came on, I turned for home. When it came time for bed, I walked back up to my room to find the sweater back on the chair where it had been earlier. There was a stack of freshly folded clothes on my dresser, but for some reason, Mom had put the sweater back on the chair. I walked around the sweater as I got ready for bed, but I kept thinking I could see it move out of the corner of my eye. It didn't leave the chair, but I thought I saw the arms wiggle or the waistband shiver slightly as I walked around the room. I went straight to bed after lights out, and in the morning, I found more bites on my arm. 3 new bites to be exact, each one on the underside of my arm, not on the outer arm where everyone might notice them easily, and each one looking much the same as the first. The sweater wasn't in bed with me this time, but I knew it had been the one to do it. Mom still thought it was a rash, but I was convinced that they were bites. For the next few weeks, I tried various measures to keep the sweater away from me. I left it in other rooms, sometimes with the door locked, but it always found its way back to my room. The closet was no obstacle at all for it, and twice I awoke to see it sitting in the chair as the door slowly closed behind it. One night, I stuffed it in the washing machine and closed the door locking behind it, and I still woke up the next morning to find it in my bed. My sleep started to suffer, and I found it hard to get a full night's sleep as I woke up to search for the sweater. My teacher told my mother that my performance was suffering, and I was given DRs several times for sleeping in class. If they'd seen what was under my sleeves, they would have probably had some questions for my mother, too. The bites were numerous, red and oozing blood sometimes. I kept them closely guarded, because if my teacher found out, I felt like my mother could be in big trouble. I kept them from both my teacher and my mother, not wanting her to ask questions either. And as it went on, our relationship became strained. She knew I wasn't sleeping well, but she wouldn't even entertain the idea that it was due to some evil sweater. She thought I was looking for attention, that I was just a typical child with an overactive imagination. But she couldn't take off work just to sit at home with me and protect me from a piece of clothing. At one point, she even threw the sweater in the garbage, thinking that would solve everything. But when it reappeared in my bedroom, she accused me of keeping it around to get attention. After 2 weeks of being terrorized, I decided to finally put a stop to it. That night, I stayed awake and watched it. The next day was Saturday, and I knew Mom wouldn't care if I slept in. I was going to catch it in the act and show Mom that it was hurting me. Maybe then she would let me get rid of it. I had a big metal flashlight with a thick blanket I was going to catch it in. I would hold on to it until it ran out of steam, and then show my mom so she wouldn't think I was dreaming. I watched the red numbers on my Ninja Turtles alarm clock tick slowly by, and by 11:30, I was having trouble staying awake. The sweater hadn't done anything but sit there all night, and as my eyes got heavier and heavier, I found myself slipping towards sleep. I lost the fight before midnight, and woke up with my head against the blanket. I looked at the clock and saw that the numbers read 2:45 a.m. I swept the light around the chair and tried to orient myself. The beam fell on an empty chair, and I couldn't help but feel dread mounting. Where had it gone? Had it slipped off the chair while I was asleep? As I searched for it in the beam of light, though, I heard a familiar sound of wire scraping against the wood behind me. I turned the beam onto my headboard, and there was the sweater. I thought for a moment that I might be dreaming, but as the flashlight illuminated it, I had to come to grips with the idea that what I was seeing was very real. The bug-eyed pattern had become a real set of bulbous eyes. The green body was a voluminous mass of fibers and filaments, and the teeth had become large and snapping. It was perched on my headboard, clearly startled by the sudden intrusion of light. It emitted a loud, otherworldly scream as it leapt at my face, and I swung the flashlight without thinking. It smacked into it with a soft woof sound, and I watched it fall to the floor next to the closet. The beam fell on it again, and it scrambled across the floor as it frantically crawled for the bed. I sat on the bed and listened as it rustled beneath the box spring. I had glimpsed its true form now. I had seen the wicked teeth that had left marks on my arm, and I was not about to let it sink them into me again. I jumped out of bed, flipping on the lights, and scooped up the sweater as I headed down the hall. The hall closet was stuffed with old tubs for storage. As I wrenched open the door, I found what I was looking for on the second shelf. Mom had an old popcorn tin, the kind you give people for Christmas when you're not sure what else to give them. As I reached for it, I felt the sweater shriek and scramble towards me. It knew what I meant to do, and it knew that it would be stuck if I did. I grabbed it before it could latch onto me and stuffed it down into the metal guts of the tin. I was going to trap it in here for good, a good long time, and there wasn't a thing that it could do about it. In the light, it was just an ordinary sweater. I made use of this knowledge and stuffed it into the tin. I heard it thrashing around in the tin and held the lid closed as I looked around for duct tape or something else to keep the lid closed. A few layers of tape over the lid, and I felt confident that it wouldn't be able to escape. I stacked a few boxes on top of it for good measure and left it thrashing at the bottom of the closet. As I went to sleep, I could still hear it beating feebly at its prison walls. The noise was like a lullaby for my tired soul. I'd like to say that this is the end of the ordeal, but this story is actually my reason for writing it all. It's been 25 years since that night, and I had all but forgotten about it. I had put it off as the overactive imagination of a child, just like my mother had, until I came home from work today. After college, I moved several states away, taking a job as an architect for a big firm in Chicago. That's where I met Emily, and now we have a child of our own, my daughter Carrie. My mother loves her granddaughter and comes to see her whenever she can, but most of the time, my mother's presence is felt through her packages. Cookies, toys, anything to make my daughter smile. And when I got home today, I found one of those packages open on the kitchen table. The box was empty, but there was a note inside addressed to Carrie. "Hi, Carrie. Grandma was cleaning out the attic and found something she thought you might like. It was your dad's when he was your age, and he used to make up all sorts of strange stories about it. It looked so lonely when I found it. I thought you might have more use for it than me in the Windy City. Love you, Grandma." As I looked at the note, my blood ran cold. What had my mother found tucked away in the attic? I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, catching sight of my daughter as she lay on the living room floor. She was coloring something in her binder, using her crayons to fill in whatever picture she had just drawn. At that moment, though, my focus was on the familiar green sweater she was wearing. The yarn was a little faded, but the bug eyes still stared at me, and the teeth smiled with that delirious mirth. As I stared, it seemed to say, "Hello, old friend. Thought you'd gotten rid of me, huh? But here I am. Time for our game to start again." Carrie turned around and smiled at me, springing up and wrapping her arms around me in a big hug. I had to stop myself from shuddering as the sweater touched me, and she stepped back a little so I could see when she was done. She did a little twirl so I could take in the whole thing, and it didn't seem to repulse her the way it had always repulsed me. "Isn't it great, Daddy? Grandma sent me this cool new sweater. I love it. It's so soft, and it's so warm." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded dumbly and walked back into the kitchen to fix myself a drink. After the second drink, I began to calm down a little, and I started writing this after my hands stopped shaking. I don't have a clue what to do. How do you tell your daughter that she's wearing something that tormented you for 2 weeks? How do you convey to her that something she loves is evil? What do I do when the bites start appearing? How do I rid myself once and for all of this evil sweater? It should have been the least stressful part of his day, but it was something that Steve would never quite get over. The kids had been bugging him to take them to the fair all week, but Steve would have rather taken off his skin with a cheese grater. He'd been working all week, his legs were killing him, and that wasn't the biggest issue at play either. The thought of bumping elbows and shoulders with people in a setting like that made him feel squeeby just thinking about it, though Steve would never admit to it. Steve had been plagued with haphophobia since he was young. It had been worse when he was younger. Steve hadn't even wanted his parents to touch him, but the thought of strangers touching him would send him into a near catatonic state. He spent years telling people not to touch him, avoiding hugs and handshakes, and stepping around people if they got too close. This set him apart from his peers and made him a bit of an outsider. After years of work and a lot of therapy, he'd gotten past some of it, but he still really didn't like to be touched by people he didn't know. Seeing his kids upset was hard, but Steve just couldn't bring himself to plunge into that kind of environment. Not until his wife had guilted him about it. "I think you ought to take the kids to the fair, Steve." He'd been half asleep, but snorted awake as he rolled over to look at her. The two were in bed, Lisa having gotten off a little earlier than usual, and they were looking forward to a much-needed night of sleep. Steve had nodded, ready to slip off into oblivion, when Lisa had spoken up. "Huh?" Steve asked, as articulate as ever. "You should take them to the fair. It means a lot to them. I'd do it myself if I didn't have to work until 11 on Saturday." Steve grasped for an excuse that would make her let him sleep and drop the conversation. "So tired from work. The boss has been working us hard, and I don't really think I have the energy to putter around the fair." She rolled over, wrapping her arms around him as he leaned back against her. Lisa would never know how much work it had taken to get to this point, and he never intended to let her find out. He had never told her about his mental issues. He was afraid that she would see him as weak or an oddball and might leave him because of it. He doubted it. They had been married for years, but it was always something in the back of his mind. I know it's been a long week for you, but it would make your kids happy. Please, for me." Steve wanted to tell her no, but it was hard to say no when she was pressed up against him. There weren't many people Steve could stand to have this close. The list was very short. Lisa, the kids, and maybe his mother. He wanted to make her happy, wanted to make the kids happy, so, despite his better judgment, he agreed to take them. So, just before sunset on Saturday night, Steve found the three of them standing at the ticket booth just outside the teeming throng of people that made up the town fair. Even now, he could feel the presence of the crowd. It teemed with life, the sweating masses that would push at him, their skin rubbing at him as he and his kids walked by. The odor was nauseating, even from here, and Steve could feel his skin crawl as he paid the ticket taker with shaky hands. As they headed through the rusty chain link surrounding the fairground with his oldest, Robbie, and his youngest, Charles, Steve knew this would be the biggest test of his mental health in some time. From the instant he stepped inside, he could feel the combined weight of the crowd pressing against him. No one actually touched him. They were a little too polite for that. But the oppressive nature of so many people moving around him was still a lot. The combined smell of sugary fair food, stale sweat, cigarette smoke, and the puff of dry earth from the fairground was like a cloud around him. The warmth of so many people so close to him and his kids reminded him of being too warm in his winter clothes. It was stifling, the miasma of emotions at odds with the smiling faces of his kids, and Steve tried to keep it together as his skin threatened to crawl right off his body. At first, Steve believed he could distract himself from all this. The food smelled good, but it was hard to keep it down with the combined smells of humanity wafting around him. Fried this and battered that went into his stomach, but even the culinary oddities couldn't keep his anxiety at bay. People sat too close to him, their heat radiating into his skin, and Steve began to feel claustrophobic as the crowd pressed against him outside the food tent. Due to COVID protocol, the fair had to ask guests to only eat in designated areas, but that didn't seem to be stopping most of them from walking around with small buffets in their arms. As he came out of the tent like a man who's seen a ghost, Steve thought maybe the rides would be a better distraction. The rides looked fun, but the seats were so close that it was hard to quantify as a distraction. Every ride pushed him closer to his fellow riders, and their skin on his was unbearable. No matter how close he pulled his arms in, no matter how small he made himself, he could still feel the warm, sweaty, disgusting feeling of the other riders beside him as their rubbery flesh pushed against his. He spent every ride feeling more and more like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin, and when Charles reached for his hand at the end of every ride, it took everything he had to grasp it. He felt ready to puke, ready to scream, and after a while he just let the kids ride the rides as he sat back and tried to keep control of himself. Rob and Charles had gone off to ride a collection of rides around the bench that he was sitting on, and as they moved, Steve moved as well. He was aware that they could get snatched pretty easily in this environment, but Rob was stocky for his age, and Steve hoped his size would dissuade anyone from messing with him or his little brother. As he sat on the metal bench, almost feeling the heat of every ass that had touched it before, he wanted to pull his knees up to his chest and feel the comfortable bump of his heart against his kneecaps. He hadn't done that since he was a kid, something that had driven his mother crazy, but he longed for that comfortable press now as the unnamed masses flooded around him. Steve would have never believed that there were so many people in this small town, but it appeared they were all on display tonight. The crowd was thick as they wove up the asphalt path, and Steve felt for his inhaler before realizing it was also something he hadn't used since high school. As the hyperventilation threatened to overtake him, a new player joined the game in the form of a loud groan in his guts. Steve wasn't sure if it had been the deep-fried Oreos or the batter-fried Twinkies, but they had put his stomach in an uproar. He could feel his guts bubbling, the rides clearly doing more harm than good in that respect. He made eye contact with Rob, cutting his eyes to the porta-potty and nodding his head towards it. Rob seemed to struggle with the implications for a moment, eyes darting between his dad and the little plastic shit box, before he finally put the pieces together and gave his dad a thumbs up. Steve was off the bench like a shot, his guts feeling like they were full of eels, and he locked the door as it clattered shut behind him. As he let his jeans hit the floor of the filthy bathroom, Steve felt a wave of calm roll through him. That might sound strange, feeling at ease in a disgusting toilet, but as his backside hit the plastic seat and the sound of the fair buzzed softly outside the rough walls, Steve found that the isolation was what he'd been seeking. Here it was just him and his thoughts, and he breathed a sigh of relief for the first time that night. As he did his business, he felt a sense of ease take the place of the anxiety he had felt for the last few hours. It felt like he might be able to return to the fair now. his burbling guts appeased as he purged the combination of fried foods. He heard his leavings splash below him, but didn't get up immediately. Steve wanted just a few more minutes, a few more seconds of quiet, and he would sometimes wonder if that had been his downfall. The universe, it seems, had found him greedy, and his punishment came a half a second before his eyes opened. He stiffened as he felt it, and could feel every hair on his body standing at attention. Something had touched him. It felt like a finger, just the pad of a single digit, but the feel was unmistakable as it caressed his inner thigh. Steve was frozen, his ease and peace gone as fast as the sour mash that had brought him here. This couldn't be real. Nothing was below him. Nothing that could touch him, at any rate. His anxiety was playing tricks on him, but if it was very convincing. He could feel it creeping up his thigh, going higher and higher, as it threatened to invade something too intimate for his mind to accept. Steve felt himself surge forward, falling onto the floor as his pants tripped his scrambling legs. In the murky light of the porta-potty, Steve saw something as it descended back into the muck of the tank. It was clearly a hand, the finger extended, and as he tried to press himself through the plastic portal to the noisy outside world, he saw it rise from the muck. It was a man, thin as a rail, who seemed to grow taller as he rose from the cesspool. His arms were cartoonishly long, their length dripping with noxious sludge. As he smiled, Steve saw teeth that looked too big for a normal mouth. The crap fell off him with thick plops, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come, and when he leaned down to loom over him, Steve felt sure that he would simply unhinge his jaw and swallow him up. Then he slid back into the repulsive stew like a reverse jack-in-the-box, and Steve felt the door open to release him into the barely lighted world. When Steve came scrambling out of the stall, his pants still around his ankles, he was screaming for help. There's something in there! There's something in the tank!" he yelled, people gathering as he tried to get his pants up again. The police may have taken their time, but the fair workers had already quartered off the toilet. People watched the door, not wanting to let anyone get out, and the crowd that surrounded Steve was very supportive. He was sitting on the same bench he had run from, a blanket around him as he tried to ignore the well-meaning strangers who tried to comfort him. He'd told the crowd what had happened, blushing at the details as he relived them, and the police arrived about the same time the pumper truck did. His son sat beside him, comforting him as he sat shaking, and he was glad for the firmness of their hands this time. An officer took his statement as the men with the hose set to work. They were using a small pumper hose, not wanting to accidentally suck up whoever might be in there, and Steve couldn't help but watch the hose jiggle and jounce as they emptied the tank. The officers had just finished taking his statement, telling Steve they would get the guy, when the truck driver came up and spoke in a low voice to the officer. The officer rolled his eyes and nodded, flipping the notebook closed as he started to go. "Wait," Steve stammered, aren't you going to arrest the guy?" "Tank's empty, sir. There's no one in there." But, Steve started, his anxiety rising again. That's impossible. I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes." "Be that as it may, tank's empty, sir. It's a crime to misuse law enforcement, sir. I'd suggest you let me get back to work." As they left, so too left the crowd, many of them now whispering darkly as Steve and his sons were left sitting on the bench. They had left then, the fair mostly over by this point, but it seemed the mistrust came with them. If you didn't want to take us, you should have just said so instead of doing something like that." They'd been driving home when Rob said it, and when Steve looked in the rearview mirror, his son appeared on the verge of rage tears. "I didn't make it up," Steve said, wanting to take offense of his son's tone, but understanding his embarrassment. "I know what I saw." Charles was silent, his embarrassment harder for his 6-year-old mind to put into words, but Rob seemed to have a pretty good grasp on his anger. "Yeah, right," he said, looking out the window sullenly. The drive home seemed to take forever, but it still wasn't long enough for Steve to find a rebuttal. His sons piled out when they got home, and Steve could only watch as they went inside and slammed the door behind them. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to rail against his oldest for the way he'd talked to him, but as the anxiety and the shame built up inside him, all he could do was lean his head against the steering wheel and sob silently into the unyielding rubber. He felt violated, doubly so after the judging whispers of the crowd, and he knew the shame wouldn't wash off in the shower. The isolation he felt now brought none of the comfort it had earlier, and as Steve tried to make sense of what he felt, he knew it wouldn't make any difference. He just sat in the driveway, crying into his steering wheel, his impotence almost worse than the fear of being touched. The stranger who had touched him tonight would remain a stranger, and that fact was the worst part of all to Steve.